Hello and welcome to the channel. Now I like doing long-term reviews on equipment on this channel, and the reason for that is I don't see a lot of value in buying something and then immediately publishing a review on it. You know, most of the time when you buy a piece of equipment, you don't find the faults or the issues until later on down the road. So a long-term review to me is a lot more valuable. I thought it'd be a lot more valuable to other people as well. Now, besides doing these long-term reviews, I'm also looking at doing sort of periodic updates on some of the equipment that I own, just to give you an idea of how things are going over time. So that brings me to today's video. So this is a set that I've already reviewed. This is a Kobalt cordless 80-volt blower and an 80-volt cordless string trimmer, also made by Kobalt. Now, they're branded Kobalt and sold in Lowe's stores, but they're actually made by Greenworks. And it's a pretty good equipment set with the understanding that it's really designed for the typical homeowner, sort of an entry-level set. It's not really heavy duty. You know, the plastics are a bit thin, but overall, I've found this kit to be quite useful. And I'll get a little bit more into the details a little bit later, but let me start with the blower here. So I don't have a lot to say about the blower. You know, it's useful, but I'm not really a power user when it comes to a blower. I didn't really have a strong need for a blower. I just bought it because it came in the kit and I thought I might use it. Now, I do use it to blow off leaves from the trampoline and occasionally to blow weeds off or grass off of the driveway. And for that, it works great. I don't know if it really has enough power to blow, you know, wet leaves in the yard, but I don't really need it for that. And for what I'm doing with it, it works perfectly well. It's super lightweight. It's really easy to use and well balanced, and just always works. And that's about all I have to say about it. I haven't done any maintenance to it. Of course, there's really no maintenance required. So I'll go ahead and put this aside, and let's focus on the string trimmer. Now, I should mention I also own the Kobalt 80-volt cordless chainsaw. That's a pretty powerful chainsaw, but it's not doing so well. A couple of weeks ago, I was doing some light-duty work with it, and I started seeing smoke coming off the bar, which is not usually a good sign. It turns out it's having an issue with the oiler, and hopefully I'll fix that pretty soon, and I'll publish a video on that. But back to the string trimmer. So I mentioned it's kind of a light-duty string trimmer, but I actually use it quite often. I'm using it usually in pretty thick and heavy weeds. So I'm not really a typical homeowner. I have a bit more property than a typical homeowner, and I use my equipment pretty hard. And this is no exception. Now, I realized that, you know, when I bought it, it might not be really heavy-duty rated, and I was okay with that because it comes with a 5-year warranty, and I thought it couldn't possibly be any worse than the string trimmer I had before. The string trimmer that this replaced was an old Troy-built 4-stroke gas model. That's made by MTD, and it really wasn't a very high-quality model, and I was always having problems with it. So compared to that, you know, this is really a dream to operate. It's super lightweight. You know, it doesn't make any noise. It doesn't produce any heat. It's really easy to use. It really results in a lot less user fatigue. And I guess the best part about it is it doesn't really require maintenance. You know, I haven't had to buy any oil or any fuel. I've bought no fuel filters or air filters or spark plugs. I don't have to warm the engine up. You basically just put the battery in and pull the trigger, and it just works. But there has been one issue, a pretty minor issue, very recently pop up. The last time I used it, I started hearing a bit of noise coming from the head here. And so I've removed the head here just to kind of show you what's going on. Now this unit, this is the second generation, I believe, of this 80-volt string trimmer. And the motor is actually down here in the head. I think the original unit, the motor was up there. But in this one here, it's on the head, and there's a little bearing here. And what I was hearing is kind of a whining noise. To me, it sounded like metal on metal, like a bearing was going out or something along those lines. And so I removed the head, and I just cleaned out the area here. And then I just doused this little bearing with this stuff here. This is a product made by Amsoil. It's called Heavy Duty Metal Protector. I've actually been using this for years. I don't know if they still make it, but if they do, it's a great product. It's basically just a really heavy-duty lubricant that is a dry lube. So when it dries, it kind of dries in a waxy state. So it lubricates, but it also helps prevent water ingress. So to me, it's really great and really useful. I just sprayed a bunch of that down into this bearing and around the shaft and put it back together. And I've used it several times since then, even in heavy weeds, and that whine hasn't come back. So I think I've solved that issue. Okay, so let me address the battery. So this is the 80 volt, 2.5 amp hour battery that came with the kit. Now, it seems to me that this battery does not have the same capacity as it did when it was new. Now, that's a little bit disappointing, but not really surprising. You know, I've seen a lot of variation in lithium-ion battery lifespans. Some of them seem to degrade very slowly over time, and some a bit faster. This one's doing okay. It's still able to run the string trimmer and the blower without too much problems. But I've noticed that in the chainsaw, it bogs down a bit more when I'm using this battery than it used to. So I have a 5 amp hour battery as a backup, and this is the one I use in the chainsaw now, and it seems to work an awful lot better. Now, if you really want to have some fun, you can put the 5 amp hour battery in the string trimmer here, and this thing really takes off. It's like putting a supercharger in place or something along those lines. It really starts to spin up fast. Of course, it's probably not really great for the motor to do that, so I wouldn't really recommend it. Now, in conjunction with the throttle control, there's also this little speed switch here, so you can select speed 1 or speed 2, and this gives you a little bit more control. So if you want to slow down the motor, like if you're cutting around small pebbles or something like that, you don't want to be throwing rocks into your windows, you might want to use 1 and 2 in heavier weeds. But also, if you're not cutting anything heavy, you can put it in 1, and that'll help to maintain the battery a little bit longer. Now, besides lubricating the bearing, as I mentioned, there's really only one other thing that I've had to do to the string trimmer, and it's not really related to a problem per se, but let me explain. So when I bought the trimmer, it came with this bump style trimmer head here. I really hate to use these. I've had a lot of problems with them in the past. In my experience, these are very easy to get tangled up inside, and they become a bit of a headache. So I took this off immediately. This has never actually been used. And I put this guy here on. So I actually have had this for a long time. This was on my previous string trimmer. So this has seen an awful lot of weeds. This is a really strong unit here. It's called the Ugly Head Hybrid, and it has worked out really well. But the problem is that when I bought this string trimmer, it was brand new, and they didn't have the right attachments for this string trimmer. They may have now, I don't know, but this at the time, this wasn't a very common string trimmer. If I were to buy an MTD or Steel or Husqvarna, it'd probably have the right attachments. But for me, I had to improvise a little bit. Now, I had to buy a nut. This is just a standard metric nut that I got from the hardware store to attach it to the shaft here. So that was a pretty easy adaptation. But the other problem has to do with the clearance here. So when I have the head all the way down, you can see there's quite a bit of a gap between the base here and the bottom of the head. And what happens is if I'm just cutting normal weeds, it's not a problem. But when I get into really long and thick weeds, they have a tendency to wrap around that shaft, and they get really tight, so tight that you can't just pull them off. And you end up having to get a knife to cut off the weeds. So I wanted to do something to kind of fill in that gap. And there are a couple of spacers in that come with this head, but nothing that I could find worked. So I had to make something. And what I did there is I was just looking around the shop to see if I might have something, and so I didn't have to buy something. And I had some PVC pipe that just happened to be the right diameter, almost the right diameter to fit around this head here. So what I did is I just taped off the bottom, and I filled in the pipe with some 5-minute epoxy, let that harden and dry, and then drilled a hole through the middle to fit up with this piece here. So what I'm doing there is I just have this sitting down here, down by the motor, and I put this piece here in the center, and that basically just fills in that gap, and I have a bit of play there so it's not spinning around. And then I have this washer that goes on top, and then the head goes on top of that. And of course that nut goes down in there. And the result is there that gap is filled up. Now I was a little bit concerned about this thing melting, this PVC pipe. It does get a little bit warm, but doesn't get hot enough to melt. I've actually used this several times now in thick weeds, and it's pretty much resolved the problem. I do occasionally get weeds wrapped around, but because the diameter is much wider now, they just come off easily. I don't have to get the knife and cut them off. So that was my little modification. It doesn't look really nice, but it actually does work quite well. So that's it. So after 3 years of use, I've really only had to do one slight modification and one maintenance item, lubricating that bearing, and that's pretty much it for this string trimmer. So I have some weeds outside. Let's go ahead and see how this little battery holds up today, and we'll see how this guy cuts, and I might use the blower as well. So as you can probably tell, this thing's really light, and I'm able to swing it around quite easily, a lot more easily than I could a gas trimmer, just because of the weight. Also, there's virtually no vibration and plenty of power and almost no noise. So I'm really not as fatigued as I would be if I was running a gas engine. Also, there's nothing to burn me back here, so I can swing it any way I want and not worry about touching up against the muffler or something like that. And it seems like my little modification is working quite nicely. I don't have any weeds wrapped up around the shaft. Just found some boysenberries. Okay, I guess that's all I have for today. This battery is showing 0 bars now, so I think this battery is done. Now, I do have a secondary battery I could go grab and plug in, but I actually cut a lot more weeds today than I was planning to cut anyway, so I'm going to call it done for the day. Now, my modification's working out pretty good. There at the end, I did get a bit of weeds wrapped around there, but this is wrapped around the little collar that I made, so it's really easy just to pull right off. Whereas before that collar was there, it would get wrapped around the shaft really tightly, where it was almost impossible just to pull off. You have to get a knife out. Now, these little strings here are quite a bit shorter than when I started, so I think these are pretty much done. And I think the battery life isn't quite what it was when I bought the tool brand new, but I think it's doing pretty well. So I guess that's about it for the 3-year update on this Kobalt string trimmer. I'm still liking it pretty well, and it's still working out pretty good. The only maintenance I've had to do, again, is just to grease that little bearing there. So that's not bad after 3 years, I would say. So that's all I have, and we'll see you next time.